scores of passengers stranded at the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja this week as some domestic airlines counters were shut down. They were sealed off. This follows an instruction from the FAAN, the Federal Airports Authority of Nigeria, over unpaid debts. Passengers of the air-marked airlines were denied access to the boarding areas with the expectation that this exercise will be carried out across other local airports in upcoming days. According to the FAAN, some of the affected airlines have been heavily indebted ahead of the COVID-19 outbreak, with mounting arrears after resumption. More aviation news. IATA, the International Air Transport Association, released recent data indicating that the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's aviation industry and economies has worsened sharply since previous assessment back in April. The outlook posits that passenger numbers, jobs at risk, and GDP impact for the 5 biggest African markets has declined across every metric, and that continued financial and regulatory support on user charges are essential to support airlines over the restart and recovery period. Joining me to discuss this development in the aviation sector, as well as the effects of this year's events on the sector, is the founder and CEO of jetWest Partners, Mr. Dikko Nwachukwu. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's begin with the shutdown of some of these domestic airlines as far as their counters are concerned at Nnamdi Azikiwe Airport on the instruction of FAAN. What do you make of it? Can you shed some more light on the development?
Hi, Rotus. Nice to be here. Very quickly, I think this has been ongoing for a very long time in the industry. Airlines have been indebted to FAAN for a very long time. And, you know, FAAN is stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. And you really can't blame them for asking for their money. It's been, of course, that also means disruption in terms of passengers who've paid to have service from cities to cities. But you really can't blame FAAN for wanting their money.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that FAAN is in between a rock and a hard place. But Mr. Nwachukwu, what about the airlines? They're also in a rock and a hard place. They were shut down for months. They now have to fly at reduced capacity. People are nervous about flying, so not that many people are flying. The global aviation industry has been, what word is to use it, decimated. So is this the best time for FAAN to be, understanding that they need their revenue, or is this the best time to be shutting down some of these shutting down some of these airlines' ability to allow passengers to fly?
To be honest with you, probably not. But then again, the industry is where it is not because anybody could, believe COVID was going to come along and shut everybody down. But it's the melees over many, many years of rot that has brought us to the point that we are today. Yes, the airlines are in trouble. Yes, the short-term prognosis for aviation in Nigeria is actually not very, very good, to be honest. And is the timing from FAAN right? Probably not. But what can they do? This is one of their only recourses to actually making any kind of money. So, until the government bailout is actually put into full effect, which we don't know when that will be, FAAN is stuck, the airlines are stuck, and everybody is stuck. Airlines have bills to pay, FAAN has bills to pay. The question is, what next? What should happen next?
Thank you. So I want to ask you about them. Do they increase ticket fare? Now, that's the tough question because it's you and I, the end users, that would have to pay that. But we've seen this with buses. I think we've also seen this with the trains. When the Minister of Transportation, Rotimi Amechi, made an announcement, I believe, when trains were allowed to resume, that ticket prices would probably have to increase. Ticket fares would have to increase to make up for lost revenue. Over, I think in Lagos here as well, I believe we had the MD of Primero here a few months back where he was talking about bus fares having to be increased because the COVID-19 pandemic had infected them. So, affected, not infected. Is there room for airlines to, pending whenever we see a bailout, any room for airlines to raise ticket fares to try to help their situation out?
That's really up to the individual airline to decide how they want to go about growing their market or getting their market share back. The truth is, it's a very, very rough time for airlines in Nigeria and globally. Nobody was in the right position, so to speak, to even combat or move out of this. And unfortunately, we haven't taken this time that we can to turn things around, to ask ourselves, how do we use this pandemic to basically put in place the foundation that allows us to grow in the future? Everybody right now is looking at short-term survival, A lot of that is also based on the fact that they're hoping that the government will bail them out. But if you look at it very carefully, Rotus, you have to ask yourself this question. How important is aviation to the overall economic well-being of Nigeria? Some people might say not very important. Aviation contributes not more than 0.4% to the general GDP of Nigeria. And if you take that number, if aviation was to disappear today, perhaps 2, maybe 4 million people will actually feel the effect. In a population of 200 million people, that might not seem like a very important thing or sector to pay a lot of attention to. Now, Nigeria's aviation, in my opinion, is still very much in the embryonic stage. We're still very much in the early days of our growth. Over the last 60 years, things have happened, and let's not dwell on that, but let's take this time as an opportunity to say, how do we put in place a proper Nigerian aviation project that actually starts to focus on making aviation a very key sector? Up until this point, aviation has been seen as a luxury good, and quite frankly, it's an essential service. I like to use the cell phones as a good example of what I'm talking about. In 2001, when cell phones became a thing in Nigeria, if you'd asked anybody that today we would have 150 million cell phone lines in this country, of which about 60% are smartphones, they would have told you were absolutely batty crazy. Now, aviation can do something very similar over the next 15 to 20 years, but it has to be long term. We need to stop looking at quick wins and start to say, how do we put in place the foundations to make this industry an essential service that actually helps the country to develop and move forward?
Oh, sir, that's, I have to, very honest remarks from you there. And you're an industry insider. You're in the industry. So what about, you take we've been talking so far about the pandemic. We haven't even gotten to the NSARS protests, the violence and the destructions we've seen. You take those two body blows to the industry. What's the direct and long-term implications of, if you take all of that all together on the sector?
Well, again, Rotus, I think we have to be very brutally honest. Nigerian aviation has been on a downward spiral or slide since about 2015. The numbers of passengers traveling by air have actually reduced. As I said to you before, Nigeria is only a 0.4% contributor to the GDP. Now, COVID and the NSARS protests have dealt two very heavy body blows to the industry that would be quite difficult to recover from. And again, it now comes down to thinking outside the box, perhaps looking at situations and saying, how do we get something out of where we are right now? Everybody's waiting for the government bailouts. My last check, I believe it was about 27 billion, which quite frankly is a drop in the ocean. But airlines have to think outside the box and ask themselves, what do I have? What do I actually own that I can use to leverage to actually raise the capital that I need to bail myself out or to get myself out of where I am? Now, 90% of the airlines in Nigeria actually own their aircraft. They don't lease their aircraft. Now, one can say that you might be able to do some very constructive financial engineering by doing what's called a sale-leaseback, which means selling your assets and leasing them back long term in a way that allows you to actually unlock the equity and the cash that is currently trapped in those assets. This is one solution that airlines might want to take a look at. If we wait for the government, I'm afraid the help might come a bit too late. It's tight all around, and airlines have to start to look within themselves and amongst ourselves in the industry and say, how do we find a way forward?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting forward a solution there, Mr. Nwachukwu. We only got a minute to go. In a minute, what are the recovery prospects as you look ahead to 2021? Briefly, if you can.
Well, IATA and everybody else says, we're not going to see the numbers that we saw pre-COVID until 2023. And I think it's actually quite premature to talk about post-COVID because we're still very much in COVID right now. As you said earlier, passengers are not as confident traveling, even though the rates of infection through airlines has been deemed to be almost zero. But it's going to take some time, and it's going to take really amazing, out-of-the-box, innovative thinking to get out of this. But again, let me say this: this is a chance for Nigeria to actually put into place the foundations to grow a very strong aviation industry over the next 10, 15, 20 years. If you want to build a skyscraper, you need a very, very solid foundation.
Great stuff. Mr. Dikko Nwachukwu, CEO, founder, JetWest Partners, thank you so much for talking to us.